In the shadow of one man's ambition, entire cities vanished, and the world was forever changed. Genghis Khan was more than a conqueror, he was a force of nature, leaving behind a trail of destruction so brutal it defies belief. In this video, we'll count down 5 of Genghis Khan's most sordid and ruthless deeds. By the time we're done, you'll be questioning how much brutality could even be possible through one human. Number 5. Psychological warfare. Fear as a weapon. Genghis Khan knew that terror could achieve what armies couldn't. Absolute submission. From 1219 to 1225, during his campaigns in Central Asia, he perfected the art of psychological warfare. But this wasn't just about intimidation. It was about total domination of the human spirit. One of his most notorious strategies was public displays of terror. After his army stormed a city, they didn't simply leave it in ruins. They ensured that the aftermath would be seen and feared by anyone nearby. In 1223, as the Mongols moved through Russian cities, they left corpses hanging from the city walls, grim reminders of what happens to those who resist. But the fear didn't stop there. Genghis Khan employed long-lasting methods of terror by destroying food supplies. His army often burned fields and poisoned wells, ensuring that any survivors of the initial slaughter would suffer a slow, painful starvation. It wasn't enough to conquer. Genghis Khan wanted to ensure the land would not recover for generations. Entire cities would vanish, their populations left to face the future without food or water. But perhaps most disturbingly, Genghis Khan manipulated religious leaders to maintain control over the population. Instead of killing the spiritual figures, he spared them to preach submission to Mongol rule, spreading fear through belief that resisting him was futile, even in the eyes of their gods. His genius lay not just in military tactics, but in his ability to conquer the hearts and minds of those who remained. Number 4. The destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire, 1219 through 1221. In 1219, the Khwarazmian Empire made a critical mistake when its ruler, Shah Muhammad, executed Mongol envoys. Genghis Khan's response was not just revenge, it was the systematic destruction of one of the most powerful empires in the world. Before his armies marched, Genghis Khan sent spies disguised as merchants to gather intelligence on their cities. By the time the Mongols arrived, they knew every weak point, every unguarded entry, every storehouse of wealth. In 1220, the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, once thriving centers of culture, were reduced to smoldering ruins. Entire neighborhoods were set ablaze, and the screams of the dying filled the streets. But it wasn't just about killing people. Genghis Khan wanted to erase the land itself. After the massacre, his forces diverted the course of the Amu Darya River, depriving the Khwarazmian heartland of its water supply. He redirected the entire river. Lands that had once been lush and fertile were turned into deserts, leaving nothing but dust in the wake of the Mongol horde. The empire was left to rot. As a final act of cruelty, Genghis Khan's armies built pyramids of skulls outside the ruins of the cities. These morbid towers weren't just for display, they were a clear warning to anyone who considered defiance. Resist the Mongols, and this will be your fate. By 1221, the empire had ceased to exist. Its people scattered or dead, and its cities transformed into nothing but piles of rubble. Number 3. The Siege and Massacre of Merv, 1221. By 1221, Genghis Khan's forces had reached the gates of Merv, one of the most important cities along the Silk Road. Merv was a center of learning, wealth, and trade, known as the Mother of Cities. But when the Mongols arrived, none of that would save it. Hoping to spare their people, the leaders of Merv surrendered. But what they received wasn't mercy, it was methodical slaughter. The Mongols entered the city and the killing began. It wasn't a quick execution either. It was done in groups. The people of Merv were gathered by the hundreds, and each group was systematically executed. The dead were piled into mass graves, buried without honor or care. In total, over 700,000 people were killed during the siege and massacre. But after the bodies fell silent, the Mongols weren't done. The libraries of Merv, which had housed centuries of knowledge, were set aflame. Scrolls, books, and texts, priceless pieces of history, were reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The city was wiped from the map in every sense of the word. Word of Merv's destruction spread quickly along the Silk Road, and the fear of the Mongols was so intense that entire cities would later surrender without resistance, terrified of suffering the same fate. Merv wasn't just a city, it was a warning, a symbol of Genghis Khan's capacity for total annihilation. Number 2. Genghis Khan's sexual conquests. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer land, he sought to dominate the entire bloodlines of his enemies as well. After each city fell, royal women, daughters, wives, and sisters of kings and nobles were taken as prizes. But these women weren't simply captives, they were brought into his harem, their fates sealed as political pawns and symbols of his victory. These women were absorbed into Genghis Khan's court, their identities erased as they became part of his own personal collection of conquered bloodlines. But it wasn't just about Genghis Khan himself. His armies followed the same practice, subjugating women as a form of control over entire populations. Rape and forced marriages became weapons as devastating as any sword, leaving entire populations traumatized and broken. Cities weren't just defeated, they were psychologically destroyed. The violation of their women was a tactic designed to cripple the spirits of the survivors, ensuring they would never rise again. But Genghis Khan's conquest didn't stop with the women. His descendants spread through the lands that he conquered. Today, genetic studies estimate that 16 million men alive today can trace their Y chromosome directly back to Genghis Khan. His conquests weren't just military, they were genetic, leaving a lasting mark on the populations he subjugated. Number 1. The Massacre of Nishapur in 1221. And now we reach one of the most personal and horrifying acts of Genghis Khan's legacy, the Massacre of Nishapur in 1221. This wasn't just a battle, it was an act of revenge so brutal it defies comprehension. During a local uprising, the people of Nishapur had killed Genghis Khan's son-in-law, and Genghis Khan was determined to make them pay. At the urging of his grieving daughter, Genghis Khan ordered the total annihilation of Nishapur. But this wasn't just about killing the soldiers who had rebelled, it was about erasing every living thing. Men, women, children, even animals were slaughtered without mercy. The Mongols moved through the city like a wave of death, killing every last person. But what makes Nishapur's massacre even more disturbing is what happened after the killing. Once the city was silent, Genghis Khan's soldiers beheaded the corpses and stacked the skulls into large towering pyramids. It wasn't enough to kill them, they had to be counted. The sheer scale of death was incomprehensible. Nishapur, once a thriving city of culture and trade, was reduced to bones and silence. It vanished from history for centuries, only to be rediscovered much later. The Massacre of Nishapur wasn't just an act of war, it was an act of total revenge, a testament to the lengths Genghis Khan would go to avenge those he loved. In the end, Genghis Khan wasn't just a conqueror, he was an architect of devastation. His legacy, built on the bones of cities and the blood of millions, remains one of the most brutal in history. Through his calculated use of fear, destruction, and domination, Genghis Khan reshaped the world. His name may be notoriously legendary, but it is the unspeakable acts he committed that continue to haunt the pages of history. If you found this deep dive into the darkest side of Genghis Khan's legacy as eye-opening as I did, hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking stories from history's most ruthless leaders. Because in the annals of the past, there are many more tales that will leave you speechless. See you in the next chapter of history.